It's really good to be together again. I look forward to this gathering every month, and we've had some quite remarkable conversations on a whole array of different topics. We recently did a study together of the history of anti-Semitism, which really was a preface to what we're going to talk about today. In the ancient Hebrew Bible, there is a statement repeated a number of times where it says, blot out the name of Amalek from under the heavens. Remember, do not forget. I'm aware of at least 6 times it's stated in the Torah. Amalek, of course, is the leader of the tribe, the Amalekites. And it's worth noting in the history of world civilizations, in most parts of the world, and this is pertinent to what's happening right now in the world, there always have been conventions of war. Whether war in ancient times, fought almost like 2 teams on a field, according to certain principles, with a class of warriors, to more barbaric type war, which we read more about in the annals of history, where battalions of warriors show up and destroy cities and take captives and booty and overrun an area to capture not only territory, but to enslave others. But whatever the scenario of war is at any given time of history, there are more often than not conventions about what's considered acceptable warfare, what's not. And in the Hebrew Bible, for example, we read a number of interesting passages having to do with the bounds of war. And in fact, Maimonides has a whole section in the Mishnah Torah about laws related to war. In the Tanakh, there are plenty of wars fought in the Tanakh, as we know. An example of a law of warfare is when you go into a city in a state of war, you're not to destroy the buildings. You're not to destroy the natural resources. You're not to attack women and children and the weak and the sick. That was a convention of war then. Of course, we like to think it's a convention of war now, but you wouldn't know it looking at what's going on in Ukraine. And the Amalekites had the distinct reputation of completely abandoning and disregarding all conventions of war in ancient times, at least according to the narrative, and made no compunction about destroying, killing women, children, the sick, the disabled, and to attack at night during sleep. And as a result, the writers of the Hebrew Bible, obviously drawing upon a long oral tradition, articulated the complete rejection and antipathy toward Amalek, the Amalekites, and their barbarian behaviors. And so that's why we have this phrase, blot out the name of Amalek from under the heavens. Remember, do not forget. Now, so that's point number 1. The thing that of course, that caption makes us question is it says, blot out Amalek, and then it says, remember, do not forget. So we're to blot it out, but not forget. Blot it out, but not forget, which on the surface, the pshat of it all looks like a contradiction. But when in fact, we're taught that it's really not a contradiction at all. We have to blot out Amalek, which means we have to stand up to Amalek in every generation. And we have to remember there will be an Amalek in every generation. Because if we forget that there'll be an Amalek in every generation, then we won't be conscious enough to blot it out. And over time, this developed in, I call it a transgenerational value. Namely, that there is an Amalek in every generation, particularly in relationship to the safety, security, vitality, and future of the Jewish people. That we have confronted the I know incarnation is a Christological type term, but the living embodiment of Amalek in different guises, in different names, in different persons in every generation. And, you know, we'll do a survey right now, right? Just in this little group, let's make a list using just our own knowledge, learning, whatever it is, of the Amaleks that we can all think of that have occurred in successive generations. Of course, number one on that hit list is Adolf Hitler.
Mhm.
Let's name some more.
Joseph Stalin,
Gaddafi.
Mhm. Mhm.
Do,
Putin right now. Yeah.
Putin certainly looks like an Amalek.
Lenin,
Mhm.
Idi Amin.
So it's not hard to like make that association.
Mm-mm.
So you realize it's not hard. The remembering is not the hard part. What the blotting out is. And I'm going to come back to that this morning, but I just wanted to put that out there to start. So remember, do not forget, blot out Amalek that recurs. And in the history of anti-Semitism, there is this transgenerational value that the adversary of the Jewish people reappears time and time again. So here we are. Today is the second day of the Jewish month of Adar. So it's a Rosh Chodesh. It's considered the opening days of the month. The moon right now. Okay, see if you make this association. If it's a new Jewish month, what's the state of the moon in the sky? Because our calendar goes by the moon.
New moon.
So it's a new moon, meaning a new month. And if there's a new moon, you can see no moon. So no moon, new Jewish month. So if it's the middle of the Jewish month, what does the moon look like? Full, exactly. And a lot of our holidays occur around the middle of the lunar month, the Jewish month, because for our ancestors, a lot of our original holidays were associated with agriculture, whether planting or harvesting. And why is the full moon relevant to farmers? They can work the field 24 hours a day, as long as it's not cloudy. And so that became, interestingly, part of the economy of our ancient ancestors' agricultural system. And a lot of our festivals originated as celebrations regarding, I call it the cosmic cycle, the cosmic natural cycle of the planet, of the seasons. And only later on, there were historical narratives added to these original agricultural events. Perfect example. We'll talk about this next month in our next Torah study in depth, but we take Passover. Passover began as a holiday called Chag HaPesach. And that was a springtime holiday. Had nothing to do with the Exodus from Egypt. In fact, the Israelites were observing this springtime festival probably for 1,000 years before they ever became slaves in Egypt. And they took that festival, Chag HaPesach, and they brought it to Egypt with them. And they had been for generations and generations slaughtering a lamb, putting lamb blood on the tent post to celebrate the relationships among the families of the clan. It was like a solidarity holiday at the springtime planting season, that the clan would stay together for another agricultural cycle with mutual support, sharing of resources, mutual protection, etc. We're taught, and you're going to forgive me, it'll be redundant, this little piece next month. We'll look at it in depth. But when the Israelites became slaves in Egypt, they were still observing this Pesach. And on the night the blood was put on the doorpost for the holiday of Pesach, the Israelites were told, tonight of all nights is a watch night of the Lord. Tonight, when you put your blood on the doorpost, like your ancestors have been doing for 1,000 years, tonight it'll take on a second meaning. It'll be a sign of God, for God to pass over the houses of the Israelites in the last plague. And then when the Israelites leave, they're released. The Torah chimes in and says, and now you will observe the festival of unleavened bread, Chag HaMatzot. And you look in the book of Exodus, and it's there. You know, a lot of times we read the Bible, we gloss through it. But if you look in the book of Exodus, chapter 20 or 21, there's a sentence where it says in black and white, and there is Chag HaPesach, the festival of the Paschal offering, and you shall do blah, 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 blah. And there is Chag HaMatzot the next day, the festival of unleavened bread, to remember the Exodus from Egypt, and you shall do blah, 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 blah. And just so you understand, two separate holidays, one day apart. Eventually, in the late Second Temple period, probably in the sometime in the early 1st century or so, those two were overlaid with each other into one holiday we call Passover. And the Haggadah was written, and when you read the Haggadah, you see elements of both, the original holiday Pesach and the overlay Chag HaMatzot. So this is the classic example of an agricultural Jewish holiday that eventually gets a historical narrative overlaid onto it. Now, here we are in the month of Adar. In this particular year, we have 2 Adars. We finished Adar 1, and now we're starting Adar 2. And the reason we have an extra Adar, meaning we have 13 months in this year, because 7 times in every 19-year cycle, 7 times in every 19-year cycle, we add a 13th month. Anybody know why? Why do we do that? Can't hear you, but give it a shot. Why do we add this 13th month? Lynn?
Give it a shot to keep the spring holidays in the spring, to keep them from drifting around the calendar.
Exactly, because just see, this is like rabbis go to rabbinical school to learn this kind of stuff. So there are 365 and a quarter days in a solar year. How many days are in a lunar year? 354 and a sliver. 354 lunar days in 12 months, 365 solar days in a solar year. So what, you have a difference, 354, 365, 54, 65. It's like, it's off by 11 days, right?
And that's why we have a solar lunar calendar as a combination, as opposed to just a lunar calendar, the way the Muslims still.
Exactly, exactly. The Muslims go by the lunar calendar, and it's always 11, every year it's 11 days sooner and 11 days sooner and 11 days sooner. And that's why Ramadan goes around and around the Muslim calendar. But we can't do that because Pesach has to be in the spring and Rosh Hashanah has to be in the fall. And if we had Hanukkah in July, then they'd say, oh, you're being like the Christians, Christmas in July, and we don't want to do that. So we have to, what it's technically called, it's called intercalate. We intercalate, it's like inter, to insert, calate from calendar. We insert into the calendar this backstop, so the holidays don't get out of their agricultural synchronicity. And that's why, but there's still fluid. Like, remember, Rosh Hashanah can be Labor Day and Rosh Hashanah can be October 1st, but it'll never go much further than that. But when we start getting all the way toward October 1st, we have one of those 7 years of intercalation and whoop, we push it back again. And Rosh Hashanah, and you know how it is for Jews. It's like when Rosh Hashanah is Labor Day, it's like, oh, it's so early. And then when Rosh Hashanah is around October 1st, oh, it's so late, but it never goes beyond that little window. And so this year is a leap year, as we call it, that has an extra month. And so Purim, which occurs during the month of Adar, and we're going to look at why, is held during the second Adar. So here we are. Today is Rosh Chodesh Adar, and Purim is going to be here in less than 2 weeks. Now, I don't know what you remember growing up about Purim, but Purim, to me, growing up in the 60s and 70s, it was the greatest thing ever. First of all, they had these awesome carnivals for kids at the synagogue. Now, I just have to tell you something, just a little aside. You ever see this show on TV called The Wall? Where they drop a ball and it kind of comes, there's all these like pins in the wall and a ball falls down and it bounces around. And at the bottom, there's like these different amounts of money and the ball falls in and they can get the money. Well, gosh, I just wish I knew what it meant to like get a patent, because when I was 8 years old, for the Purim Carnival at Temple Emeth in Chestnut Hill, I built one of those things using nails and elastic bands. And we would drop marbles to bounce its way down to the bottom. And if it landed in the right spot, you got a goldfish. And little Bobby Lennick invented that, back in 1966 or 1964. So, but I got no credit for it. So now it's a big, big time game show on NBC or whatever it is. But the Purim Carnival, true story, honest to God, but the Purim Carnival, this revelry was so much fun. And going to synagogue and we would dress up, and nothing better for little kids than making a lot of noise. And I'll just show you, I have a couple of, this is an antique grogger right here.
Oh, yeah, here, do it.
See, they don't grogger anymore, but they, well, anyway, These are my antique groggers. Now, I just saw something this year for the first time. Groggers cowbells.
Oh.
I find that so annoying, you have no idea. But the groggers, because it says, blot out the name of Amalek, it in a transgenerational value, we're told when we read the story, the book of Esther on Purim, we're supposed to blot out Haman's name because Haman is the incarnation of Amalek. We blot out Haman's name. Someone once asked, well, why do we keep blotting? Why do we do it over and over and over again? You know, because, you know, the adults saying, all right, you did it at one time, you made the noise, twice you made the noise. Why are you doing this over and over again? Why do you have to make so much noise over and over again? Because we can't be lazy when it comes to blotting out Amalek and Haman. And I remember these things as a child. And then as I got older and I was, you know, a young teenager, you know, then you used to hear stories is that people could drink on Purim, you know? And I never understood why until I got old enough, they said, but you drink on Purim and they have these parties. And when I eventually got to be a teenager, I used to go to the reading the Megillah in my conservative synagogue in Brookline, Massachusetts. And when that was over, a group of, I think we were maybe 14 years old, 15 years old, we'd walk across Brookline, Massachusetts, and we would go to the Orthodox synagogue on Beacon Street, where they were celebrating Purim. And can I tell you, I never saw a party like that in my entire life. They're just dancing around and there's like whiskey just sitting out on tables and they're eating and their children up on their shoulders and they're dancing till 1, 2, and 3 in the morning. And I thought, this is just, what a great religion we have. And of course, there were the costume parades and the dressing up. And for a child, this was like a magical experience. And generally, in most of the Jewish world, people think of Purim as this child-centered holiday. When in fact, what I want to talk to you about today, it is probably the most serious of all the Jewish holidays. The most serious, the most profound, the most complex of every one of the Jewish holidays. And Jewish tradition makes this point itself. And that's what that's really the subject of today's learning. So before I go on to that, any questions so far? Any comments?
This is just not quite related, but I saw a scribe once, and before she was doing her scribe work, she writes Amalek and crosses it out. Could you?
Absolutely. When a sofer, scribe, writes a Torah scroll or a mezuzah or any sacred Jewish document on parchment, before they write, they have to, that's one of the commandments, to write the word Amalek and cross it out. Again, blot out the name of Amalek. Good, excellent. Any other comments to this point? All right, so first of all, I want you to know that the story of Purim is fictional. There's a lot of this, I'm going to unpack that right now. You know, a lot of thinking, this is like a real story. I mean, if it's in the Bible, it must be real. It is very real, but it is not based in historic fact. It is what is best called an allegory. It's an allegory, maybe reflecting some historical circumstance, but it is not a narrative of actual events. but is trying to teach a lesson pertinent to understanding history. So it is an allegory. And we know this partly from the language of the book, and we know this because there are references in the book that we know just don't exist. The book is presumably taking place in Persia, or what is now modern day Iran. And there's some language in there that may suggest some suggestion to that. But there is no history of the Jewish people living in Persia or Iran under these circumstances. And we also know it's not historical because the story itself, when you really read it closely and pull it apart, it's a parody. And a lot of the characters in there are overdrawn, exaggerated characters. The second thing about the fact that the story is fictional in the book of Esther is that the name Esther, that's not a Hebrew word. In fact, tradition says her Hebrew name was Hadassah. But she is called Esther. There's no reference to a king Ahasuerus anywhere in history. There's no reference to a Haman anywhere in history. And in fact, even the customs in the book don't necessarily reflect Persian customs or behavior. And so there's a lot to support the theory that the book wasn't intended to teach the history of the Jews per se. It was, however, written, and many scholars now really believe this, to give a message to a particular group of Jews in history. So it's not a book about a situation with a king and an evil Haman and a Mordecai and an Esther who actually lived at a time and place, but it is written to use those characters to say something to a group of Jews at a particular time and place. See the distinction? Now, do y'all know the story of Purim in the book of Esther? Because I'm happy to review it.
We know the story.
Y'all know the story. Well, I will say this, you all know at least the first half of the story. I bet you most people don't know the second half, because the second half usually doesn't get talked about, and I'll explain that in short order. Now, the other thing is, the book itself probably was written after our ancestors were already observing the holiday. And that seems like a fine distinction, but there's evidence that there was this event in post-biblical history. When I say post-biblical, if you take the Tanakh, and we have three major sections of the Hebrew Bible. The first is called the Torah. The second is called the prophets. And the third is called the writings. Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings. So the book of Esther, the Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, is part of the section called the writings. And a lot of the books that are contained in the writings, we call them post-biblical, that they're not related to the experience of the Torah in the desert, the Mosaic tradition. They don't grow out of the time of the kings and the prophets. They refer to things, we say post-biblical. Post-biblical is generally, talking about a period of time after the first exile in Babylonia in 586 BCE, after that time period. And so there's some evidence that there was an observance of this thing called Purim based on an oral tradition, and that ultimately that tradition was written down in the scroll of Esther, the allegory at the basis of the tradition. Which is kind of interesting because we tend to think it would work the other way. Someone wrote a book to teach a story, and then someone read that story and said, oh, we need to create a holiday around the story. But it actually seems to have happened in the opposite way. Which means that the transgenerational value at the heart of Purim was something people knew about, the oral tradition, the message in the allegory as an oral tradition was known for a very long time, so much so that there were observances of remembrances and rituals associated with the message. And then the book is eventually written down. Now, how does the book get its name? Or how does the holiday Purim get its name? So it's interesting. It's a combination of an Akkadian word and Hebrew grammar. So Akkadian is sort of the Proto-Semitic language. Some would say was the Akkadian, Sumerian, original, sort of the alphabetized written language. And the word pur means like lot, a lot, or a die, like for dice, pur. And it's a very, very ancient Akkadian word. Purim, adding the sound im at the end, is a Hebrew grammatical addition. Mm-hmm. So Purim means lots. Lots. And why is it called by this name? Because in the story, when Haman, convinces Ahasuerus, and by the way, when I do this with children, this is what I make fun of Ahasuerus, and I talk about him by saying, Ahasuerus. And every time I say his name, I fake a sneeze. Ahasuerus. So Ahasuerus makes a decree to destroy the Jews. And how do they come upon the date for the destruction of the Jewish people? In this allegory, he throws lots. And the lot comes out the 13th of Adar. And thus the holiday is called Purim, the day of the destruction of the Jewish people in the allegory, according to the throwing of these lots. To understand the purpose of the allegory, there's also now consensus that the book and the story were composed for people not living in the land of Israel. It was written for diaspora Jews. Written for Jews living outside Israel who either have been outside by exile or outside by migration, for Jews living outside the land of Israel, who were in various times and places under tremendous pressure, tremendous oppression. I think about it as it could have been written for the refugees of Ukraine.
How did they think these texts would reach those people?
The power of a story. The power of a story. And remember, you had traveling teachers and traveling storytellers very much embedded in this period in history. And there's, what was mass media 2,000 years ago? Someone rode into town and had a story to tell. But to get a sense of we know the story. You all know the story about this organized oppression against a group of people the foolishness of the powers that be, and the premeditated attempt to destroy them, deny them their liberty, deny them their lives, while they're living in another country. And the threat of forced assimilation, and God, what do they call it? It's called Ukraine, I think. And you can imagine a story like the Book of Esther or the oral tradition behind it of how powerful that might be to 1 million refugees who are being forced out of their homes and mistreated, and saying, but don't worry, you will overcome. You will overcome. And part of the evidence that it was written for diaspora Jews is also because the language of the book has a lot of assimilationist type language. A lot of like imitating the outer culture in order to get along. I mean, look at what Esther does when she becomes queen. She's a Jewess in every respect, but she puts on the act as a good queen, dresses up as she's supposed to, does all the things she's supposed to. She accommodates the customs. She assimilates in a sense. The thing about Mordecai in the story is that while Esther represents, in a sense, on the one hand, the importance of going along to get along, Mordecai represents the opposite, right? He's the resistor. He's the overt resistor. He will not bow down. He will fight back. But we find out, of course, later that Esther is also the true resistor in the story. But she does her resistance below the radar until the very end. And so you're talking to people, assimilated, people who are under pressure of assimilation, living in faraway places under, outside rule. And you're trying to say, here's what it looks like to survive. Next thing about the Book of Esther that figures in, again, to this message about survival. God is not mentioned even once in the Book of Esther. And it's the only book contained in the canon of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, where God is not mentioned. And in fact, there's some material in the Talmud to suggest when they debated the canonization of the Tanakh, there were a lot of rabbis who said, it shouldn't be there. God's not mentioned. How can you put a book in the Bible? God's not even mentioned one time. But they decided to include it in the writings because, again, the message to an alienated, oppressed, diaspora, assimilating people and giving them a message how to survive. Part of that message is you can't wait for God to fix this for you. And that in fact, even though the rest of the Hebrew Bible is filled with a whole long list of examples of God's intervention and performing miracles, Esther's included in the most incredible, ironic sense, saying to people, if there's going to be a miracle, it has to come through you. But even though it comes through you, when you start enacting this resistance, you will feel God's presence in the equation. And so while, the rabbis had a good, simple, logical reason to exclude this book from our Hebrew Bible, they obviously understood that, now we're talking about the more profound meaning of the story, understood that it's one thing for God to intervene, change the course of history. It's quite something else when human beings rally around ideas like freedom, liberty, independence, self-determination. When human beings take on that role themselves to be freedom fighters, to stand up for these ethereal values. Jewish thinking would say it proves God was right to begin with to create humans and the Jewish people because of this development in human awareness and the courage, the bravery that can be asserted by people on behalf of themselves and others. And that when human beings do that, God not only celebrates that, because if you think about it, when human beings stand up in this kind of way, it's the highest form of free will. It's one thing if I have free will to eat the ice cream that I like. It's another thing to have the free will to marry the person I love, which also is an act of courage for some people, right? It's quite another thing where you put your life on the line for something you believe in. And part of the underlying message of Purim and this book of Esther is that when we do that, we are channeling the divine into the world. And so the idea that God's not mentioned to me is just profoundly meaningful. Because although God's not mentioned and God does not intervene, does not mean God is absent or doesn't care. Couple more things, and then we're going to get into the really juicy stuff. This isn't even the juicy stuff. Yo. There are 4 laws you're supposed to observe on Purim. Anybody know what they are?
I didn't know there were any.
Yep, there are 4. First of all, you're supposed to have a feast.
Feast. Feast and give gifts of food and give to the poor.
So that's 2. They're supposed to have a feast on Purim to celebrate the I think I have this, the inimitable power of the human spirit, the Jewish spirit. 2, shalach manot, right? And that's the exchange of presents between friends and family. And there's matanot, 3rd commandment. You're supposed to give gifts to the poor as a way of expressing one's sense of blessing for survival. And the 4th is you're supposed to hear the reading of the Megillah. So it's interesting, eating hamantashen is not one of the 4.
Are you sure? Can we
Maybe,
do
maybe
that?
that could be fine.
We'll call eating hamantashen a custom. But these are, over time, became the 4, if you will, halachot, laws related to Purim. A feast of Thanksgiving, sharing gifts with family and friends, giving gifts to the poor, and hearing the reading of the Megillah. Now, the Talmud then later added, not a commandment, but said, and there's another very important way to celebrate the holiday of Purim. And that is, you're supposed to get so drunk that you can no longer tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. Now, that actually is the doorway to now the heart of the seriousness of Purim. The way we understand this is if you look in the Torah regarding the commandment for Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur in Leviticus is referred to as Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonements, plural. Yom HaKippurim. So the rabbi said, so Nu, what are you talking about? Atonements? And their first answer to the question was, on Yom Kippur, there's two atonements going on. Understand the word atonement as at one meant, coming together. It is not just the Jewish people reaching out to God on Yom Kippur in one direction. It's God reaching out to the Jewish people as well. So it's a two-way street. So Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonements, is referring, first answer, to this reciprocity in the experience of atonement between God and the Jewish people. But in the 18th century in Lithuania, the grand rabbi of that period, the Vilna Gaon, and I usually don't share this, but it's definitely been proven and studied, and my daddy used to tell me this. I'm a direct descendant of the Vilna Gaon. And I didn't believe my father, but I checked it, it's true. And all I can say is the Vilna Gaon was one of the strictest rabbis of the last 2,000 years. And he's got to be rolling over in his grave thinking about, Rob Lennick, rabbi. Because I'm definitely cut, though from the same family of a different cloth. But the Vilna Gaon, who was very strict, and some believe was one of the two or three singularly responsible for the survival of the Jewish people in the 18th century during that time period. From Lithuania, he suggested that this phrase Yom HaKippurim should be translated differently, not as the Day of Atonements, but as in this way, Yom Ha, which means the day, Yom Ha Ki, like Purim, meaning the day like Purim. That Yom Kippur is when the Bible says Yom Kippurim, it's saying the day like Purim. You're thinking, what? The connection between Yom Kippur and Purim? They couldn't be more opposite. They couldn't be more opposite, right? I mean, think about it. Yom Kippur, you shall afflict your souls. And we fast. We stay in synagogue all day and night. And very solemn. And then on Purim, it's like, I can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordecai. Couldn't be more opposite. But the Vilna Gaon, of course, we have discussions of this in the Talmud itself, said, no. These two holidays are actually very intimately connected. And the first way that they're intimately connected is both holidays, whether it's through solemn self-affliction for Yom Kippur or through celebration and revelry on Purim, are both built on the same basic hopeful idea that there will be a tomorrow. And that tomorrow will be better than today. I mean, what's the whole point? We go through this whole ritual of Yom Kippur, Teshuvah, atonement, all in anticipation of the new year ahead, where we get to have like a clean slate. And that is at the heart of Jewish hopefulness. The gates of repentance are always open. We get a chance to, acknowledge what's been wrong, change the direction of our life. Teshuvah is to change direction. And on the day after Yom Kippur, it's a new start. The question is, the thing about Yom Kippur is you go through that whole thing, that whole intense, very serious ritual. But the real question is, and then now what are you going to do differently tomorrow? And the same is true with Purim. Because with Purim, it's like the people are about to be destroyed. The day of destruction is known. And then by certain twist of fate, it turns itself on its head. And the question for the Jewish people, once they've been saved from evil Haman is, and what are you going to do tomorrow? Now that you've been saved, now that you get another chance, now you get to you've fought for your freedom. Now, what are you going to do with it? Same thing on Yom Kippur. You have laid bare your life through the rituals and the liturgy and the whole experience and the drama of Yom Kippur. Now, tomorrow, what will be different? Now, it gets even more profound than that. With Yom Kippur, we don't know the answer to that question. But unfortunately, in the story of Purim, we do. Because in the book of Esther, and this is the second part of the book, the last part of the book, we know what happens in that book after the Jews of Shushan are spared. They are spared, and Mordecai becomes prime minister, and Haman, his children are hanged. The story tells us what the Jewish people do after their liberation from this. And this is the part people never want to talk about. In fact, growing up, I never heard it. What did the Jews do the morning after? They went out and they pillaged and they murdered and they took revenge against the Shushanites. So like Yom Kippur, the end of the story is not written. But in the story of Esther, the end of the story is written. Yes.
I just wanted to ask the question. It's always troubled me, the end. I have been aware of the end of the story, but it's always troubled me. Is the lesson that part of the risk of being free is turning into exactly what you hate?
Oh, yes. Exactly. And you're exactly right. And the rabbis and the framers of our tradition understood this profoundly. Okay. and the way you just said it is so perfect, that once liberated, the liberated risk the slippery slope to becoming the oppressor. Because that is at the heart of human nature.
They were talking about that on NPR this morning. Did you hear that, Miriam? Yeah, there was a story and they touched this exact thing this morning. It was so interesting.
Oh, this is at the most profound level of human existence. Wait till I tell you what the rabbis did with this. It's incredible. So that risk, that slippery slope of the liberated becoming the oppressor is sort of at the heart of the challenge of human nature. It's not just a Jewish challenge. It's inherent. We see it all the time. We see, just talk about the transmission of violence in families. Victims become oppressors. Multi-generational carrying on of abuse. It's an issue in human nature. I think the rabbis were profoundly aware of it. I mean, when they talked about the sins of the parents being visited on the children to the third and the fourth generation, I mean, that how endemic that risk is. And you have this story of Purim, which comes right out and says it explicitly as possible. The liberated became the oppressors. And it turns out that's one of the reasons we're commanded to get drunk. On Purim, to show us how fine the line is between Haman and Mordecai. Like a couple of drinks, you can't tell the difference between them. A couple of drinks, you can't tell the difference between the liberator and the oppressor. Think of all and then you can look at it metaphorically. Think of all the different types of intoxicants, not just liquor and other things, but power, the intoxication of power, even the intoxication of freedom, leading you to slip down that slope and become an oppressor. Like the very thing we strive for can be the very thing that intoxicates us and prevents us from protecting, cherishing, and lifting up the very thing we wanted to achieve. So you realize how it's very profound. To me, it is at least. And this is all contained in rabbinic tradition. But then, finally, sof, as we say in Hebrew, and then the rabbis did something truly incredible. There is a midrash in rabbinic commentary that says this: when all the other festivals are abolished in the Messianic age, Purim will remain for eternity. It gives me goosebumps when I read that. It actually does, because, oh my God, these people were like so off the chart brilliant. They just were so brilliant to like, again, say that, which seems, again, so ironic, so contradictory, so nonsensical, and yet it's not. It's so to the heart of why I say Purim is the most profound of all the holidays. So imagine this Messianic age, which in Jewish tradition means, the lion will lie down with the lamb. There'll be no more war. We'll live in this, kind of, perfect kind of world. And we won't need to observe Passover anymore because everyone will be liberated. We won't need to observe Shabbat anymore because Shabbat will be all the time. We won't have to observe Yom Kippur because we won't have to sin. We won't be, and our relationship will be like totally synchronized. This Messianic age. But just want you, we are going to keep Purim in the mix.
But I find that so interesting and learning about Purim, because growing up in my neighborhood in New York, I never heard the word Purim. There were 3 holidays. There was Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, there was Hanukkah, and there was Pesach. And we were secular Jews. We were just neighborhood Jews, and there was no Purim. There were no other holidays but those 3. And it wasn't until I moved out of New York and I didn't live in Jewish neighborhoods in all the places that we lived and joined temples. And all of a sudden there were other holidays aside from those 3. And I learned the word Purim and learned other words. And there were other things other than those 3 very important holidays, which really weren't the most important. So it's fascinating to learn about Purim,
Yes.
especially when you say how important it was, because I never heard the word back in our Jewish neighborhood in New York.
Very good point. And it is in the scheme, the hierarchy of holidays, I suppose, it's considered a minor holiday. You know, let's face it, let's talk about this just since you brought it up so right. You know, there are holidays that are biblical holidays. They're mentioned in the Torah. And we know what those are: Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, and the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuot. They're in the Torah. Hanukkah's not in the Torah. Hanukkah's not even in the Tanakh. It's a historic event that eventually developed a narrative and became a festival again related to the few overcoming the oppression of the many. Purim, also considered a minor holiday, usually categorized as a historic holiday, but it's not, as I just told you. It's an allegorical holiday. It's more about the message than, you know, the facts. You know, and then we have a 3rd class of holidays. You know, I call these the modern cycle: Holocaust Memorial Day, Israel Independence Day. You know, there are holidays like that. But this notion that when all is said and done and everything is made right, you know, and the ideas of Kabbalah come to fruition and all the broken spheres are brought back together, and we're in this messianic time, that Purim still will be observed. Because even in the messianic time, we're still going to be humans. And as much as could have happened to bring us into a messianic time, we could take ourselves out of it. So we have to always remember. See, it's interesting. Remember, do not forget. So while we might reach a messianic time and we've blotted out all the Amaleks, we still in a messianic time can't forget that inside each and every human being, there's a Haman and a Mordecai. Sorry, they're male characters. And there's an Esther. There's an Esther, a Mordecai, a Haman in every single human being. And the line between them can break down with any number of intoxicants, artificial or innate. And that's why I think Purim, it's the most intellectual of all the holidays, to me. And the one that provokes, in some ways, some of the most profound lines of thinking. And with that, I'll open it up to the rest of you. Questions, comments?
Why didn't they teach any of this stuff when we were growing up?
Because I didn't think you could handle it.
Can you speak about the placement of Purim before Pesach on the calendar? Is something in the meaning of Purim supposed to inform us as we go towards Pesach?
Good question.
That's a really great question. I think that actually, if we look at it's really interesting. If we look at Pesach as the holiday about beginnings, not just the agricultural cycle of beginnings, but the holiday that talks about potential. And also the story of the Exodus, which is the beginning of, if you will, at least symbolically, of, in this case, it's a group of people, but you could speak of it just in terms of an individual's journey toward freedom. And if we look at Passover as sort of the induction into an awareness about what is freedom, the aspiration for freedom. God wants us to be free, but God wants us to have responsibility within our freedom. And then you cycle all the way around the Jewish calendar to Purim. Purim in some ways represents the end of the freedom narrative, saying, now, once you have it, what are you going to do with it? And remember that freedom itself can be intoxicating. So, and again, I have to be honest, I've never articulated what I just said before, but your question provoked that for me. That Passover is the induction, and then Purim becomes the riddle at the end. And that cycle from Passover back to Purim represents, not only a cycle regarding nations, peoples, but it's also individual humans, families. Wow.
Oh, that's brilliant. Wow.
Oh, thanks for that. But I don't know how brilliant it is, but at least it could be looked at that way. And your question was the brilliant part.
I want to comment on some of the thoughts that occurred to me while you were, speaking. And of course, Lynn's comment sort of brought it together again. I do like astrology, and I've been listening to a lot of Babylonian astrology podcasts and stuff. But I just want to tell you something I noticed from this calendar discussion. Okay, like the chart, the wheel is 360 degrees, and oppositions in all branches of astrology are very important. The way you talked about Purim and Yom Kippur, they're pretty much directly opposite if you look at the 360 degree, sphere.
Yeah.
And astrologically, Purim falls in the time of Pisces, and which is directly opposite Yom Kippur, which is the time of Virgo. And I've always, in the old synagogues, there's always astrology. So I've been in a lot of those synagogues, and so I've wondered about this, like bringing back. Now, the thing about, Pisces is the time of no boundaries, openness to the world, but it's also a time of, intoxication, using substances, hiding out, and not knowing the boundary between self and the huge awareness of the universe and that interrelationship. The time of Virgo, which is when Yom Kippur happens, is a time of a lot of, the qualities are discrimination, being able to be somewhat of a ascetic personality sometimes, and giving yourself, putting discipline into your life and looking at your hygiene, both mental and your physical hygiene, and how to deal with it. So, but the thing about it is that, and the major point, and not everybody, but the Babylonian astrologers talk about that, is that you cannot define one aspect of humanity without the other, which is exactly what we're talking about.
Exactly.
So asceticism and withdrawal into self-discipline is also dangerous, unless there's boundaries. And the
Exactly.
same thing goes for celebration and losing oneself, and then
Exactly.
losing yourself in boundaries. So that to me was very interesting, that how tied these holidays are into that old astrological calendar, the world calendar. And it's also related, of course, to agriculture as well, because when the question you asked, what happens after Purim in Passover, that's basically the time of Aries, and it's the time to, strike out afresh into the world. But you don't know the philosophical stuff you went through in the time of Purim. You've forgotten that. You're starting fresh. Then by the time Yom Kippur comes, you're beginning to learn how to discipline yourself. By the time Purim comes, you've forgotten that discipline as well, and you gotta experience that final dissolution and then start anew with Passover. Of course, I just formulated all this right now, so
Good.
so that was one of the things that
Very
occurred to me.
good. It's
I just
very
wanted to
good.
add. The other comment, which comes from earlier thing, and that comes from my childhood in Turkey, is listening to a lot of stories, fairy tales. And then, I listened to a lot of fairy tales from like Turkey, but also from the Middle East too. And yet everything about Persian fairy tales was like the extreme of the fantasy. It's a world that somehow Middle East, it's all part of, the culture is all between Turkey, Israel, Syria, Iraq, Israel, that's all very intertwined. But when you talk about the land of the Persians, that's like a fantasy world. That's like a world that is,
Bigger
not,
than life. Bigger than life.
yeah. And if you look at the map, it's right across the Red Sea. And a lot of times people didn't cross really, except some, traders, but it was sort of, if you look at it, it's the other shore. It's the other shore of reality. And a lot of these stories that are about Persians have mythical characters, a lot more than some of the, Middle Eastern, and they're different. The angels are different, the kings are different, the tyrants are different. So when we look back at the story of why we're talking about this takes place in Persia, there may have been an element of that fantastic storytelling, allegorical teaching, and it was a good place to actually place the story in Persia. That was what I was thinking.
Great.
But those were my thoughts just
Wonderful.
today.
I know, right? Just today. Just today.
Just today.
Wonderful, really great connectivity there, with what you
No.
just shared. And, let's go a little step further about this cosmic tendency toward balance, right? Separate from the Western Hellenistic idea, light and dark are separate entities, but rather they're just different degrees of the same thing, moving in different directions as a continuum. And the continuum, really is about balance. Whether you describe it as, Virgo and Pisces, or Yom Kippur and Purim, or a whole variety of things. That's at the heart of Kabbalah. And we see it expressed in Jewish tradition all the time. For example, as trite as it seems, that the idea of inserting a dramatic awareness of balance is why we break a glass at a wedding. Something as simple as that. A moment of, tradition would say marriage is, we hope so, is bliss. It's the closest thing to bliss two people can have. And yet we commence that with shattering. So at a moment of the highest form of coming together, or symbolizing and hopefully living the unification of two halves of one soul, which is what Judaism believes about marriage, and both physical and otherwise, we break a glass. Now, I know they say to get rid of evil spirits, we make a loud noise, blah, blah, blah. But let's just look at the gestalt of that, the shattering of something at the moment of inception of the greatest unity. Again, this expression of a continuum. And that the real, I guess, key is to be aware of both, to be aware of the relationship between different things that seem like they're in opposition, but they're not. They're just part of this continuum of experience and of cosmic reality. I'm not a social anthropologist by any means. But I remember when I was in college, I was a philosophy major, and my area of philosophy, and I wrote my thesis, had to do with the philosophy of language. And one of the things I learned during that time was that the two schools of thought about language, that there is no reality without language, and that there is reality without language. And that language itself is part of what sets up human beings to mistake the way things really are. Like, language is our friend, but not always. And it's language that sets up these dualisms that may not actually reflect the way things are at all. And, let's face it. This, I think, deeply ingrained pattern behavior, where if you can't say it, it's not real. If you can't measure it, it's not real. It's so dominant in the world now. The whole world is just, it's either or, either or, either or. And that's a structure of the mind, in some respects, defining the world itself in the most unhealthy way. And like I said, I'm not a social anthropologist, so I don't know how you overcome that in this world of ours. But I think more and more there are people who realize the limitations of disjunctive language. They realize there are limits to that. And it's very interesting. In some ways, you have one, major segment of the world that they're just committed to their set of definitions, and they will cancel anything else that gets in the way. And then there are people in the world who can actually live with contradiction without the need to cancel one or the other. And I don't know how we help the world evolve more to the second, but I do know it's all about education. And you have to teach people they are able to think that way.
Rabbi, I want to add that that's the importance of learning several languages early on in life. And
Yes.
hopefully not from the same language family, because I speak, I
Right.
mean, it's helped me a lot. It confuses you at the beginning, but I speak, 2 Romance languages, one, English, and then I understand German, and then I speak Turkish, which is Ural Altaic, and they all have different structures, and all the power to them for confusing me all my life. But that's how you think out of the, language box. That's one of the ways, I think, and it's very important for people to speak at least 2-3 languages, in my opinion, at least be able to think and feel in them, you know? That's one way of getting of it.
I so agree. I so agree.
Yeah.
I just remember a long time ago, I went to India and I learned Hindi.
Can you move over to the microphone a little more?
Yeah, sorry. A long time ago, I had lived in India and I learned Hindi and Urdu, and I just remember being completely blown away. It's exactly what you said. Like they think differently.
Yes.
They see the world differently, and I think I agree with you. It is so important.
Mhm.
Yeah.
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 There's also another perspective of being totally centered in the mind, or learning to have attention in the heart, which is another way of
Yep.
taking information and seeing.
Mhm.
Right.
Well, we talked, and this morning we referred to that in the fact that the book of Esther not mentioning God still is assuming you can feel it. Like, you may not be able to say it, you may not be able to describe it, it may not even be there in black and white, but it can be felt. I once heard a story about it was a rabbi who said to a little child, said to a little daughter, said to the daughter, "Show me your love." And this little person, no, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Let me say, the rabbi said to the daughter, "What is love?" And the little person said, "Daddy, that's a silly question." And then gave her daddy a hug around the neck, like, like little children do. And I always found that to be just a very simple, profound story, because the child didn't need to describe it. The child didn't need the words at all. Child just felt inclined to a gesture. And the rabbi, after telling the story, says, and all I know is I felt love around my neck.
Rabbi, what you were talking about earlier about like language limiting our thoughts and understanding and everything, like, does Judaism address that more?
Of course, in the most basic, think about this, in the most basic sense, fundamentally, we are told you cannot name God.
Yeah.
I mean, you can come up with pseudonyms. Adonai, which is a pseudonym. Hashem, which is a pseudonym. Hamakom, which is a pseudonym. But it's a thing you can't name, because you can't contain it even in one word. Because anything you would say or think, it's more than that. So in a way, fundamentally, Judaism is acknowledging out front, there's a limit to language. And how about living with that all your life? And that's part of what I think stymie. I mean, there are a lot of people spiritually inclined who have no problem believing in, or in their own sense relating to, an ineffable deity. What does ineffable mean? It's an interesting word. Ineffable. Someone's going to look it up. Go ahead. Good. Let's look at, would you look that up? Ineffable.
Why, Google is so smart? Google knows everything?
It's pretty good with basic definitions.
Yeah. Pretty good. Let's see.
Ineffable.
Too great or too extreme to be expressed and described in words.
Okay.
Was it saying, Neil?
Too great or extreme to be expressed or described in words.
But just because it can't be described in words doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean it doesn't.
Yeah, it also says not to be uttered.
Mm.
The ineffable Hebrew name that Gentiles write is Jehovah. That's a sentence, you know.
Mhm.
Ineffable.
Yeah.
It's knowable, but it's not sayable.
Mhm.
And Jews are raised to believe in that,
Mhm.
like ineffable. And that's part of what I mean, as I said, there are plenty of people from a spiritual perspective who understand ineffable and believe in that. But there are a lot of people in the world, the notion of ineffable, not concrete, not statable, not nameable, it doesn't exist.
So what's wrong with it being whatever you want it to be?
That's why we say ineffable. Look, you know, that makes me think about, again, it's a frame of thinking. So the great, I believe it was Durkheim in the 20th century, okay? And this became part of a political process when they were trying to talk about poverty in the United States. And you would have people drive through a slum and they'd look at that and say, that's poverty. And then you'd have people of the school of Durkheim who would say, no, it's not. Just because it looks like it, it's not poverty until you go in and measure it. It's not poverty to go in and count them, ask them, write it down, document it, put it to words, put it to language. There's no poverty in that building until you can tell me how many people are living there, how much food they need, how much food they lack. But just to look at the building and sure looks like poverty to me. And again, this idea that it only exists if you can name it or measure it, you know, or quantify it, you know, is just a kind of an example of the difference. Like I knows it when I sees it. Anything else? We should probably stop. Anything else before we go today? And thanks everyone for the great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
So interesting. Yeah, thank you.
That was phenomenal.
Yeah.
Rabbi. Thank you so much.
So next month we'll do a primer for Passover.
Okay.
A primer. Okay, good. Thank you.
This has been recorded, so it'll be on our Facebook or our website, YouTube channel.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye, Leona.
Shabbat
Bye,
shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Stop the recording.